year or so is firstly that the retreat has gone further than perhaps we thought on these and on a whole number of other questions which aren't really the topic of tonight, but also that there's a clear denial almost that these wars existed, and certainly about the consequences of the wars. And one of the elements of this denial about the consequences of the wars is that the commentators, the politicians who supported those wars in the first place, people who tend to blame the anti-war movement for, I don't quite know what, but for being the people who opposed them, and that therefore we're subject to kind of greater opprobrium than practically anybody else, even though we've spent the last 20 years opposing wars and campaigning against wars. And alongside that, there's also been the sort of shameless rehabilitation of humanitarian intervention. So particularly when the launch of the Open Labour pamphlet took place, you had Lisa Nandy, who's the shadow Foreign Secretary, spoke at it, obviously welcomed the contents of the pamphlet, and clearly sees it as not just simply a series of ideas about war, but clearly about a much more activist intervention by the British state, and fully supported by Keir Starmer's Labour Party. And this has been supported by all sorts of other people, including the sort of the many of the commentators who were so opposed to what we did. And it's an amazing thing, really, that these were people who supported the war before it started, supported it all the way through, supported it afterwards, were slightly put off guard by a few basic facts, like weapons of mass destruction were never found. And indeed, David Aronovich, one of the leading, one of the keenest cheerleaders for the Iraq War, said that if WMD weren't found, he wrote in the summer of 2003, he said, if they're not found, then I'm never going to believe anything that the government says again. Unfortunately, that hasn't been some principle that he's stuck to, and he's continued to believe all sorts of things that governments have said, not least about this question of intervention. And I think when we look at the intervention, and when we look at the role of Labour in the whole doctrine of humanitarian intervention, it's a very, very substantial role. If you look back to Tony Blair, before even the Iraq War, Tony Blair was somebody who was very keen on the intervention in Kosovo in 1999, and actually went and made his speech in Chicago, a famous speech that he made about the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, the importance of countries intervening in order to stop human rights disasters, in order to stop the oppression of women, in order to stop all the wrongs that exist in the world, are going to be solved by decent humanitarians who see the value of backing up their ideas by military strength and military aid. So, you know, if you look at the role of Labour in supporting those wars of imperialism, it was true in 1999. It also was most obviously true in 2003, where Blair was given the option of not playing a central role in the invasion of Iraq, because even the United States government could see that the opposition to war in Britain was such that it would be a problem for him to carry on with the intervention. Blair totally rejected that offer out of hand and went into Iraq with as much enthusiasm as George Bush or anybody else. The record is there for us all to see. The record in Iraq is still a catastrophic record. The war and the occupation destroyed all sorts of elements to do with the country, and it's still a situation where conflict and war is still very, very real, where the plight of people who are displaced and who are refugees is still very, very real. The same is true of Afghanistan, which barely gets a mention anywhere in the British media and in the British government. But we have now had, it will be in October, 20 years since the US and the UK and various other international forces invaded Afghanistan in order to overthrow the Taliban. There is still a war going on there. There is still very, very high levels of casualties. There is still massive displacement, and it remains one of the poorest countries in the world with, unsurprisingly, very little that has been done to advance the position of women, which is one of the main reasons we were told that they were going in. And, you know, this record is a record which is a bipartisan record. We know that Tory governments successively have been in favour of military spending, in favour of wars when they occur. But this is also true of successive Labour governments as well. And if you look at the record, this endless war that we've now seen for 2 decades, the military spending, which Boris Johnson announced only a couple of months ago, would be increased substantially, adding up to something like an extra 23 billion on top of the existing very high levels of military spending. And of course, it's worth saying, when you look at the 6 billion that's being spent on 2 aircraft carriers alone, this is money which could otherwise go on welfare, on health spending, on dealing with the problems of the pandemic, of all of those sorts of questions. But also it projects a very, very false view of where security for people in this country really lies. And if you look at the government's own assessment, they actually consider the questions of climate change, they consider the questions of inequality, that consider the questions of the pandemic. These are all serious questions of security. And yet we are still spending billions of pounds on conventional warfare, or indeed on nuclear Trident submarines, in a way which doesn't even make sense in terms of the concerns of security of millions of people in this country. So I think, you know, my feeling in wanting to do this was to try to put this record straight. I think that for 20 years we've written plenty of things before, obviously defending what we've done and what we are planning to do, but I feel that after all this time, we should be able to be holding the government to account, and if necessary, the opposition to account. And this is one contribution that we wanted to make. And I just wanted to make a couple of points about some of the things that we said in it, that we dealt with this whole question that they now raise all the time about campism, that if you're in opposition to war in this country, you must be in the camp of another country. You must be you must be dancing to the tune of another country. You must be supporting another country, and the implication obviously being that you're in some way disloyal to your own country. This kind of notion which is put forward, and it seems to me this has always been a very dubious concept and continues to be a dubious concept. I think, you know, there's a range of opinion among people in Stop the War. There'll be a range of opinion of people in the room tonight, but I would have thought it's absolutely obvious that you can have an anti-war movement. Indeed, you have to have an anti-war movement which is an indigenous opposition to what its government's doing, just as you have political activity around opposition to cuts in the health service, or opposition to the trade union laws, or anything else you can talk about. Why shouldn't you, in this situation, have people who aren't thinking, I support a country, some other country somewhere, but who are thinking, I don't like what my government is doing. I don't like the priorities that they have. I don't like the way in which they are spending billions of pounds on warfare, which is waged against some of the poorest countries and people in the world. That, it seems to me, there should be an understanding, the basic understanding, that the anti-war movement has life in its own right, regardless of what its individual members think of any other country around the world. And this is something that every single war that we've been involved in opposing, we have been accused of being acting on behalf of another country. We've been told this about Saddam Hussein, we were told it about the Taliban, we've been told it about Gaddafi in Libya, we've been told it about all the different things. We're told it now about Russia and about China. And in all these cases, it is a completely actually they're the people who have the kind of campist view, because everybody who's not with them has to be somehow with the other side. Now, that actually isn't the case. And if you look at the history of people who have stood up against wars, if you look at William Morris in the 19th century, if you look at Keir Hardie in the 20th century, if you look at the people who opposed the Vietnam War, I would argue the prime reason that they did so was opposition to what their own government was doing, and revulsion at the idea that war was actually going to be the way in which you solved anything. And so I think it's important to kind of outline that particular point in it. I also think it's you know, the pamphlet which was written that we critique, the pamphlet by Thompson and Pitts, claims that our theory about, you know, conflict and about war and is under theorized. Actually, you could make the same claim about the official Labour view. You know, we had Hilary Benn standing up and justifying the bombing of Syria a few years ago in Parliament, making this grand speech which invoked images of appeasement and the Second World War and the Spanish Civil War and all this kind of thing. Actually, if you look at official Labour's record on this, Labour's record, actually, it wasn't Labour officially, it was many Labour Party members, but it wasn't Labour officially who were the people who campaigned and fought and organised the international brigades and the opposition to people in the Spanish Civil War. It certainly wasn't Labour who led the campaign against the Vietnam War. It wasn't Labour who led the campaigns for the independence from colonialism in places like Rhodesia and South Africa. And so this whole idea, if you actually look at the people who led those campaigns, who campaigned against wars, who did all those sorts of things, actually you find they often did so against the wishes of the Labour leadership many, many times, and as part of a very broad and wide movement of people who did want to oppose these kind of things. So I think it's important to make that point as well. The final point I want to make is this, that, you know, when people say, you know, why is the anti-war movement saying this? Why are they opposing their government? It just seems to me that really one of the basic things that any of us should do, whether we're socialists, whether we see ourselves as people who are just campaigners and activists campaigning around all sorts of different things, seems to me that one of the main things that the left and the anti-war movement should be doing is standing up to its own government, is not believing everything that its own government says. I mean, we're told the countries that we are meant to support and the countries we aren't meant to support. We're told the wars we're meant to support and the ones that we're not meant to support. And I think we have to have a critical faculty which says we do not trust what our government says on these questions. We do not trust the BBC. I noticed on Monday when the BBC was reporting an airstrike in Yemen, which hit a place which killed lots of refugees, a refugee centre. It described, the report of it said, Saudi Arabian Air Force airstrikes attacked a place which in conflict with Iranian-backed Houthi militia. They don't say, you know, so you don't get US-backed or UK-backed Saudi Arabia, although it certainly is backed by those countries. You do get the Iranian-backed Houthi. So, you know, we've got to have some critical faculties here. We shouldn't just believe what our government says. We know on a whole range of questions, it hasn't told us the truth about wars. It hasn't told us the truth about military intervention. It hasn't told us any of these things. And I think that when they say to us, well, you know, why are you saying the British government doesn't do enough about whatever it is, about the Palestinians or any of these things? Why are you saying that when you don't talk about all these other questions that the British government wants you to talk about? I think our answer should be very, very simply, we oppose oppression and we oppose what is happening to people throughout the world. But unlike the British government, we're not selective in our sympathy for people who are suffering. What we are determined to do is hold our government to account. And I think this crucial question about what we can do as an anti-war movement is put pressure on our government, is campaign against our government and its allies in order to bring an end to these wars. That seems to me is one of the most important things that we can do. So when we talked about doing the pamphlet, it was to deal with some of these arguments, and Andrew will obviously talk about some of the other arguments as well. But these are real arguments. Do we want a society where governments have a majority in Parliament, which they clearly do, but anyway, they very often have support from the opposition. They very often have support across the House of Commons. Do we really want a situation where these people are going to be able to do all these sorts of things without being questioned, without being opposed, without people standing up and be counted? And that's what Stop the War has tried to do for the last 20 years. And I hope the pamphlet is a small contribution to continuing with that.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Lindsey. We now go to Andrew Murray, who was chair, as most of you I'm sure will know, of Stop the War for 11 years, and then also worked as advisor to Jeremy Corbyn while Jeremy was the leader of the opposition. Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Tarina. Obviously, Lindsey's outlined many of the points that we make in this pamphlet. I mean, if you look back on now 20 years of Stop the War, it's been through several political phases, I suppose, in that period. And we've just more relatively recently come to the end of a phase where the sort of ideas that Stop the War stood for were represented at the highest level of the Labour Party. Jeremy Corbyn personally was leader, and as Lindsey says, I think the fact that he became leader, and he would acknowledge this, was in part due to the anti-war campaigning that he had been very associated with, and a revulsion amongst Labour Party members at the Labour Party's record in that respect under Tony Blair. Now that phase, which for me was encapsulated best by Jeremy making a public apology to the Iraqi people, to the British people, to the world for Labour's involvement in the Iraq war, as he'd promised to do in his campaign for election of leader. That period has now evidently come to an end. And for me, the thing that represents how much it has come to an end in terms of the politics of the Labour Party is this guy, Wayne David. Now, Wayne David is fairly obscure, but I think, unfortunately, not obscure enough. He's an MP, Labour MP for Caerphilly, but more relevantly, Keir Starmer has appointed him the shadow minister for the Middle East and North Africa. Now, what has Wayne David been doing since he became MP for Caerphilly? He voted for war in Iraq. He voted for war in Libya. He voted for intervention in and bombing in Syria. So his record on the Middle East and North Africa is pretty clear. This guy is an all-out supporter of war and interventionism, and Keir Starmer has given him that portfolio in his shadow team. Now, Wayne David is relevant because when this pamphlet that Lindsey and I polemicise against in our own pamphlet was published by Open Labour, it was immediately endorsed by Wayne David, and his ringing phrase was, "This shows that Labour must abandon its obsession with anti-imperialism." Now, any remotely objective look at Labour's record in the course of this century would be that it's actually the obsession with imperialism, and indeed Wayne David's personal obsession with imperialism, which is writ in every line of his parliamentary CV, that is the problem, not the so-called obsession with anti-imperialism, the anti-imperialist politics, which Jeremy Corbyn took to the leadership of the party for a few years. And the danger must be that this obsession with imperialism, which, as Lindsey rightly says, I mean, didn't begin with Tony Blair. I mean, Tony Blair was perhaps an extreme manifestation of it, but one can find its traces deep in Labour history. That this obsession with imperialism is now going to become Labour's official policy again. And let's remember that when Jeremy was leader, the biggest single rebellion against his leadership by Labour backbenchers, the PLP weren't well disposed towards him at all, but the biggest single rebellion was when he asked them to vote to end arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And somewhat over 70 Labour MPs broke the whip to say, no, we want to continue selling arms to Saudi Arabia. So the obsession with imperialism, unfortunately, has a constituency. And our pamphlet is, I suppose, designed to try and mobilise to resist that trend. We also quote Lisa Nandy, who is in a way Wayne David's immediate boss. She's the shadow foreign secretary. During the leadership election campaign that produced Keir Starmer as its outcome, she attacked Keir Starmer on this issue from the right. Keir Starmer had said, as one of his pledges, that there'd be no more, he would be against illegal military interventions. She attacked Keir Starmer for reopening old wounds about Iraq, which made it harder to win the argument that in so many other instances, intervention, whether it's military, diplomatic or aid-related, mattered. Note how military intervention is sort of wrapped up with foreign aid as if they were all just part of the same package. But she is highlighting a dangerous trend, which is to treat the Iraq war as an aberration. Nobody defends the Iraq war now, or almost nobody defends the Iraq war, but it's tried to sort of park that as a mistake, a misjudgment, but otherwise interventionism is fine. That appears to be Lisa Nandy's argument. She was actually attacked by a Financial Times columnist who said that these sort of ideas are actually as steeped in imperial nostalgia as any Brexit fantasy of gunboats and military glory. Because there is an idea that sort of imperialism, interventionism is really something that's mainly done by the right wing in politics. And in the whole debate around Brexit, which we're obviously not going to get into here, it was argued that those who supported Brexit, the right wing in politics, that they were motivated by sort of a desire for Britannia to rule the waves again. But actually, these ideas can find just as strong an expression within the Labour Party and under sections of the left as they do on the right. It's just their expression is different. It's packaged as humanitarian interventionism, war to do good, to bring democracy or whatever. Now, this is a variation. I mean, interventionism was never wanted for arguments. 150 years ago, interventionism was to either spread Christian civilization or stopping another imperial power from spreading it first before we got the chance to. More recently, interventionism was justified by the need to stop the communists, even in places where there were no communists or the Communist Party was tiny and very small. Now, all these arguments are more or less exhausted now. Now it is humanitarian interventionism. And one of the things our pamphlet does is remind everyone that the record of humanitarian interventionism has been an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. Humanitarian interventionism in Afghanistan, as Lindsey says, has brought no peace in 20 years, led to epic increase in opium production, and hasn't advanced Afghanistan towards democracy one whit. In Iraq, it's led to millions of deaths and refugees internally and externally displaced. Libya, it's resulted in the collapse of the state, the functioning government, and an immense refugee crisis. Syria, too, a huge number of deaths and refugees. Now, of course, in many of these instances, there are internal wars and struggles as well, but the intervention of the imperial powers, the big powers, has exacerbated, prolonged, and intensified the misery in all cases without exception. So we need to remind people of this, because the idea is now coming back that perhaps with Joe Biden in the White House, a Democrat in the White House, and so on, there could be interventionism could come back. Now, actually, to be fair, the new US Secretary of State actually said recently that they'd learned their lessons and they weren't going to go for democracy, wars for democracy anymore. Well, we shall see. We hope that they have, but we have to remain vigilant, because, I mean, the quotes I've given you show that the interventionist itch is alive and well at the highest levels of the Labour Party once again. And when Wayne David says we must drop our obsession with anti-imperialism, this isn't only or simply a matter of foreign wars, although that is the worst aspect of them. Imperialism affects our own politics in so many ways as well. I mean, most obviously, in the way it stimulates racism, it causes a refugee crisis, that it demonizes the refugees who come to Britain and other countries fleeing the wars we have started in the countries that they come from, Libya, Syria, elsewhere, suffering from poverty, exploitation, and ultimately war. The arms sales to Yemen. I mean, how the arms industry is an absolutely core part of imperialism. They have exercises immense political influence, and we have a situation now where even the Americans are stopping arms sales to Saudi Arabia for their war in Yemen, but Britain won't do. That's a consequence of imperialism. The huge role of the City of London laundering capital around the world, that too is an aspect of imperialism. So we need to stand firm on Jeremy Corbyn's anti-imperialism and not let it be demonized by the team that have succeeded him. Now, of course, we're not talking about the same world as 2003. Then we were still in the unipolar moment when America had almost unchallenged domination in world politics, or at least it seemed that way. Now we have new dangers arising. A Cold War being directed against China, with Britain spending a vastly expensive aircraft carrier, which is, I mean, so expensive there's no money left over to put any aircraft on it. So those are having to be borrowed from the USA. That is being sent to the Pacific as part of a confrontation with China. And all of this, unfortunately, has been cheered on by the Labour leadership, which has pledged its undying commitment to NATO. For what purpose? It doesn't explain. Its undying commitment to nuclear weapons, and is wrapping it all up in the flag, as if that is somehow going to win Labour an election. Well, I mean, all the polling evidence is showing that it won't, that any elements that it wins over by moving in a sort of a chauvinistic direction will be more than compensated for by losses amongst people who had been won to Labour by Jeremy's leadership and are now going to be lost again. So I think these are the main arguments that the pamphlet is directed towards saying there needs to be a struggle in the Labour Party over this issue. Polling has shown that Stop the War remains an immensely popular organisation amongst Labour Party members. Now, I know some people on this meeting tonight are Labour Party members and some aren't. Doesn't really matter. But if you are in the Labour Party, we must get these arguments had in the constituency parties. If you're in a trade union, have those arguments, because we don't you cannot afford any backsliding on this question, because the wars that Stop the War was founded to oppose have been terrible enough. They've led to dreadful consequences, as we've outlined. But if we are now talking about enhanced confrontation with China, enhanced confrontation with Russia, those wars are merely the foothills of the Himalayas of future conflicts if we allow imperialism to set the agenda. So in its 20th year, unfortunately, Stop the War is as essential as ever. So I would just like to end by obviously asking everyone to read and promote the pamphlet, but perhaps more importantly, to carry on building Stop the War and taking our arguments forward throughout the movement in our country. Thank you.